Back with you tonight here on In Focus. Several experts have attributed the recent deadly storms in parts of KwaZulu-Natal as well as the Eastern Cape to climate change. A study last year by a group of UK universities predicted that over 60 countries could see their credit ratings cut because of global warming by 2030. Climate change could also see 4% of global annual economic output lost by 2050. With poorer parts of the globe disproportionately hit. For more on this and how South Africa can safeguard itself, we are joined by Ethekwini Municipality Senior Project Advisor Shahid Solomon. Shahid, good evening. Good to have you with us tonight here on In Focus. Worst case scenario, if government does not respond appropriately with the correct policies and correct action, what are we looking at by 2050 as far as the country's economy, employment, inequality, and so on and so forth, with an unemployment already sitting at way over 60%, depending on what definition you're looking at?
Well, if you look at the devastation in the image behind me, this is the Quarry Road settlement on the Palmet River in Durban, and gives some idea of the type of devastation that flooding can cause. This particular settlement, 200 houses were lost in a short period of time, and it's quite now well understood that almost 460 people, possibly more people, have lost their lives in the floods in KwaZulu-Natal. Huge sections of the city were cut off for more than a week because of flood waters. And this is a very extreme but very pertinent example of what climate change means. Flooding, of course, is an example of an extreme event. But going with flooding comes serious periods of drought. So what we are often seeing in the settlements that you see in this image is people who've had to move from rural areas because of droughts. So droughts typically displace millions of people from rural areas. And in fact, the whole central part of South Africa is likely to desertify as climate change intensifies. Typically, people then move to the floodplains in relatively rainy areas and then become victims of the floods that we see now. The impacts of climate change, of course, go beyond the quantity of water, but also the quality of water. So, for example, in the Western Cape now, we have an economy that's highly dependent on agriculture. The effects of climate change and deteriorating water quality mean that fruit can no longer meet the kinds of export standards required from the EU because of the declining quality of the water, and the declining quality of water is linked to the relatively low amount of water within rivers and streams, and the fact that sewage now occupies a large percentage of the base flow of many of our rivers. So when we combine the effects of hotter water, less water, and flooding, this has very serious implications for agriculture, for livelihoods, and for the economy in general.
Yeah.
Of course, one of the most notable victims of the Durban floods was the Prospecton industrial area, which includes the Toyota manufacturing plant, which is almost completely inundated, and will result. We don't yet have the numbers. I work for a global facility called the City Finance Facility, which helps municipalities to link with climate finance globally, and we're currently doing a detailed economic impact assessment with the municipality to really come to an understanding of what the cost was of this flood. But I can give you a simple statistic, and that our projections have shown that by 2040, Durban would be spending almost 200 million rand a year repairing damaged culverts as a result of the increased flooding and the impacts thereof caused by climate change.
So, if we are talking mitigation now, many are saying, for example, we need to act and we need to act fast. What are the areas that need to be prioritized as far as the action that needs to follow? Following, of course, such a crisis in that picture, basically, that I'm looking at. And what do we do to safeguard that community from experiencing such a disaster again?
So, Tabo, if you look at the picture behind me, you'll see a whole lot of green stuff on that bridge. Now, what happens is that we have alien vegetation growing in the river corridors. This is typically a reed called Spanish reed with very shallow roots. When floods come down, huge amount of alien vegetation then enters the river system, ultimately ends up on the beaches. And all it takes is a log to jam one section of the bridge. And then the Spanish reed collects on that. The litter from which, unfortunately, most South African rivers serve as kind of litter conduits. The litter then sticks on that. The silt then comes and sticks on the litter. And you effectively then you have an almost impermeable dam wall created. That then bursts through the sides of what was formerly a bridge. And within 1 hour, an incredibly expensive 20 or 40 million rand bridge has been completely destroyed. Now, this whole situation that you're seeing behind me is totally avoidable. And it's avoidable simply by taking good care of riverine corridors, cleaning the litter, planting especially riparian vegetation, making sure there are no large growths of trees or clumps of debris which can fall into the river, removing waste. In this way, it's simply by keeping riverine corridors clean, we would be able to get rid of the majority of the flooding events that have happened in Durban this year in April. For 7 years, Durban has been running a program in its poorest communities called Sihlands Imvelo. In the Sihlands Imvelo program, co-ops within the community are each paid a monthly stipend by the municipality, and they keep stretches of up to 10 kilometers of river absolutely clean. They keep it clear of alien vegetation, they keep it clear of litter, and therefore create a situation where we actually are able to create jobs in the communities that need it most and protect the rivers from flooding. Exactly what the impact is of that, we're currently doing a study now to determine precisely where we had implemented those measures and what the effects were. But I can say with complete confidence that at least a half of the flooding damage that we've seen now would not have happened if we had simply implemented basic measures to keep rivers clean, to make sure there's no alien vegetation, to remove litter, and maintain the banks of the rivers and streams with natural indigenous vegetation. And of course, the other big game changer is restoring wetlands. And in the case of Durban, where you saw those horrific images of containers kind of stacked on top of each other like Lego pieces, that was simply because those areas were built on wetlands. Now, we cannot think that by totally disregarding the natural law of where water congregates and the role that wetlands play as sinks to take excess water. We can't simply build on wetlands and think everything is going to be fine. So there are bitter lessons here to be learned about not working against nature, about working with nature, and simply taking very good care of our riverine corridors.
Shahid, I'm not hearing you speak about the other question of how much we emit. I mean, it sounds like a simple question. However, it's not as straightforward. You're saying let's work with nature. Is this a question that we need to be asking? Do we have major drivers of emissions in South Africa? Many are actually arguing that in developing countries we actually don't, and I wonder how much of it contributes to such disasters that we are seeing.
Yes, thank you, Tom. So there's always in climate, there are two sides to the debate. One is adaptation. So in the photograph behind me, the question becomes, how do we adapt to the devastating effects of the global warming that has already happened and will continue to happen? The second challenge we call mitigation is how do we actually reduce the amount of carbon dioxide entering into the atmosphere and causing global warming. So South Africa is one of the leading polluting countries in the world because of our dependence on coal. We have a highly as a country, we make a completely disproportionate contribution to global warming because of our dependence, some would say addiction to coal. And South Africa has been very fortunate now to have benefited from a massive multi-billion rand injection from the major countries of the world as a result of the COP meeting in Glasgow. And this whole program is called Just Transition. So most of the biggest countries in the world are assisting us to transition from an economy that is highly dependent on coal and other fossil fuels to one which is renewable, which is based on renewable energy, be that solar, be that wind, and very many levels to the renewable energy options. And the process of transitioning, of course, is going to create a lot of job losses, particularly in Mpumalanga. And what we are trying to do in South Africa is figure out how can we make this transition to a much less fossil fuel intensive economy without seriously disrupting the economy and seriously affecting the livelihoods of the miners and the workers who at the moment are very, very dependent on the coal economy.
Do we have to look currently at some of our policies? I mean, the policies in place adequately enough? Is it just a question of implementation of our climate change policies, or does the crisis that we have seen in the past 2 weeks require for us to go and re-look what is in those policies?
To be honest with you, Thabo, I think that, as a country, we always lead the world with policies. We're very good at policies and strategies. So our Just Transition strategy, recently released, is one of the best in the world. Our adaptation strategy is also one of the best in the world. Durban, for example, has been a leading light globally as a city that's embracing climate change. Where we always fall down as South Africans is when it comes to implementation. And implementation means two things. It means money and it means systems. So in Durban, we've been working with the Municipality of Durban now for 3 years to help them to design the kinds of systems that they'll need, the partnerships that they'll need in order to avoid the devastation that you see behind me. That total program over 10 years will cost about 10 billion rand and will require mobilizing dozens of river management partnerships. Is Durban ready to implement that? Probably not, but most of our work over the last years helped them to develop a credible implementation plan so that the various departments, the various systems all then talk to the climate challenge in a very practical and very direct and implementable way. We've also now recently started work with Cape Town, which is not as challenged, but Cape Town has 2,000 kilometers of rivers and streams. Durban has 7,400. So Durban is an incredibly intense situation, but Johannesburg, Tshwane, and many other South African cities are also quite severely affected. Yeah. And to avoid this kind of devastation, there's going to have to be very serious commitment, not just financially, but also in terms of getting the different departments within the different municipalities to work together to understand the seriousness of the climate challenge, and then to also engage with communities. So it's completely impossible for any municipality to take full responsibility of the full length of a river unless communities are willing to change their behavior, unless communities become willing to avoid dumping and avoid treating rivers as waste conduits. Then unfortunately municipalities will always be struggling to deal with the impacts of climate change and the flooding which follows from that.
What is your suggestion? We have competing priorities. One is a struggling economy, so there is a developmental imperative, right? And one of the strategies we are adopting is mass industrialization, so we can open factories and get more people hired so that we can deal with this issue of poverty, because that has also led to other ills in society, including unrest and so on and so forth. One of the other areas that we are looking at is agriculture as a way of creating employment. Now, both these issues, industry as well as food production, are said to be major contributors to global emissions. How do we approach that and strike a balance?
Right, so the lazy answer to that is to say that when it comes to mitigation, we talk about just transition. How do we make sure we're creating more jobs in renewable energy than ever existed in the fossil fuel industry before. So far, there's very, very good signs. So far, the economic impact studies indicate that the renewable energy economy is actually going to create more jobs at the end of the day, and more sustainable jobs, and more jobs in small businesses, and more jobs that are accessible specifically to black people, because we can never be colorblind when we talk about poverty in South Africa. So the Just Transition Program and the Just Transition commitments, I believe, are going to deal with that and are actually going to create thousands of jobs in a really important, fast-growing renewable energy economy. The same applies to adaptation. Here in Durban, we're talking about transformative adaptation. So how do we create jobs whilst adapting? In order to implement the very simple measures that I've discussed in Durban, we would basically create 10,000 permanent jobs. Obviously, a lot more jobs around different issues that occur, but we would also grow the green economy and be able to link skills development programs and enterprise development to transformative adaptation. So I think there is a way out. It's not an either or, it is both and. We need to deal with climate change, but we also have to deal with the fundamental issues of unemployment and poverty and inequality in our economy. And I think South Africa is actually starting to lead the way. We haven't until now, to be quite honest, but there are very positive signs that the president has now created a presidential climate change commission. We've had massive support coming from some of the biggest donors in the world. And I think as a country, we're about to enter a very interesting phase where we're actually going to be starting to lead the world to show how we can actually reconcile two worlds that could be very, very far apart. Because quite frankly, I mean, we might have the best climate change mitigation adaptation in the world, but that hardly makes a difference when we're also dealing with abject poverty. And if you look behind me, you can see the kinds of living conditions that people are experiencing here in the Quarry Road informal settlement. Yeah. Part of the reason why almost 200 families lost their homes is because those homes should never have been there in the first place. So we have to look at everything.
So more than a change in the economic system as well, Shahid, you're saying it will also need our individual behavior to change, more than just looking at those things that are in the economy. Here's another controversial question, which I don't know whether you can have an answer to. Can we create a world with net zero emissions?
Absolutely. You know, Cape Town, for example, has just developed a net zero carbon strategy for all of its municipal buildings. So they're busy retrofitting all of their municipal buildings to be net zero carbon by 2030. A number of corporates have also committed to net zero. A number of countries have also committed to net zero. But this is a transition. It's an expensive transition. Nobody can really put a number on it. Some people have said $6 trillion US. It might even be $600 trillion US. It's an expensive transition, but managed well, it's a transition which is also going to create millions and millions of new jobs globally. And we just have no choice. Yeah. We cannot live with the devastating effects of climate change, but at the same time, we have to deal with the issues of economic growth and poverty.
Shahid, we appreciate your time. Thanks so much for coming on. Ethekwini Municipality's Senior Project Advisor, Shahid Solomon, the impact of climate change on the global economic output.